Siona God, hello all. Oshistahia, good evening. Wado, thank you for watching. This is day 9 of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. In Eric Hoffer's account of a mass movement's need for unifying elements, he classified hatred as one of those elements. He quoted Hitler as saying that if there were no such thing as a Jew, in quotes, we should then have to invent him. What? We should then have to invent him. It is essential to have a tangible enemy, not merely an abstract one, end quote. Hoffer added. F.A. Voigt, V-O-I-G-T, tells of a Japanese mission that arrived in Berlin in 1932 to study the National Socialist movement. Voigt asked a member of the mission what he thought of the movement. He replied, end quote, "It is magnificent. I wish we could have something like it in Japan, only we can't because we haven't got any Jews," end quote. What? The tragic history of middlemen minorities around the world shows that often there are many substitutes for Jews in the role of scapegoats as well as in their economic functions. In terms of their achievements in the arts and sciences, Jews have been unique, not only among middlemen minorities, but also among the world's population at large. They have been particularly overrepresented among the leading figures in such fields as mathematics, the sciences, and philosophy. In the second half of the 20th century, Jews won 29% of all the Nobel Prizes in the sciences, medicine, and literature combined. Even though Jews were less than one half of 1% of the world's population. Wow. Such spectacular achievements have come only in relatively recent times as history is measured. These have been largely the achievements of Ashkenazic Jews, who were excluded from civil society for many centuries in most of Europe where they lived, and their remarkable rise to prominence among the leading intellectual figures dates largely from the 19th century, when severe restrictions on them were relaxed in a growing number of European countries. It was in the new nation of the United States that Jews were first accorded civil equality, and it was here that their greatest successes were achieved. Another way of looking at this is that much of the world for much of history lost the benefits of the talents of these people and of similar people elsewhere through suppression and persecution. While the intellectual achievements of Jews have been unique, the bigotry and persecution that they suffered has been the fate of middleman minorities around the world. While there are characteristics and achievements which are uniquely Jewish, the history of middleman minorities around the world seems to suggest that it has not been these uniquely Jewish characteristics which called forth venomous hatreds, but characteristics and achievements common to middleman minorities, both when they are in that occupational role and after they move beyond into a wide range of occupations. Whatever is unique to each of these groups may be seized upon by those promoting. I'm sorry, I'm listening to my son. I'm trying to make out what he's saying because he's working with my hamster upstairs, doing a little Father's Day small reno. Anyway, so hopefully you guys are enjoying the holiday, but celebrate your dads no matter what day it is. Whatever is unique to each of these groups may be seized upon by those promoting hatred of them, but that does not mean that the promotion of hatred in the first place has been due to qualities unique to each group. However unique any of these groups may be, historically, the kind of hostility and hatred they have faced has been generic. The real history of slavery. Ooh, yes. Let's go. Land on me. Slavery was an evil of greater scope and magnitude than most people imagine, and as a result, its place in history is radically different from the way it is usually portrayed. Mention slavery and immediately the image that arises is that of Africans and their descendants enslaved by Europeans and their descendants in the southern United States, or at most Africans enslaved by Europeans in the Western Hemisphere. No other historic horror is so narrowly construed. No one thinks of war, famine, or decimating epidemics in such localized terms. These are afflictions that have been suffered by the entire human race all over the planet, and so was slavery. Had slavery been limited to one race in one country, During 3 centuries, its tragedies would not have been 1/10 the magnitude that they were in fact. Why this provincial view of a worldwide evil? Often it is those who are most critical of a quote-unquote Eurocentric view of the world who are most Eurocentric when it comes to the evils and failings of the human race. Why would anyone wish to arbitrarily understate an evil that plagued mankind for thousands of years, unless it was not this evil itself that was the real concern, but rather the present-day uses of that historic evil? Clearly, the ability to score ideological points against American society or Western civilization, or to induce guilt and thereby extract benefits from the white population today, are greatly enhanced by making enslavement appear to be a peculiarly American or a peculiarly white crime. This explanation is also consistent with the otherwise inexplicable contrast between the fiery rhetoric about past slavery in the United States used by those who passed over in utter silence the traumas of slavery that still exist in Mauritania, the Sudan, and parts of Nigeria and Benin, Benin. I did a thing on that. The main different places of slavery, when it started, when it became illegal, and when it was abolished, if it was ever abolished. Why so much more concern for dead people who are now beyond our help than for living human beings suffering the burdens and humiliations of slavery today? Why does a verbal picture of the abuses of slaves in centuries past arouse far more response than contemporary photographs of present-day slaves in Time magazine, the New York Times, or the National Geographic? It takes no more research than a trip to almost any public library or college library to show the incredibly lopsided coverage of slavery in the United States or in the Western Hemisphere as compared to the meager write-ins on the even larger number of Africans enslaved in the Islamic countries of the Middle East and North Africa, not to mention the vast numbers of Europeans also enslaved in centuries past in the Islamic world and within Europe itself. At least 1 million Europeans were enslaved by North African pirates alone from 1500 to 1800, and some European slaves were still being sold on the auction block in Egypt years after the Emancipation Proclamation freed blacks in the United States. Indeed, an Anglo-Egyptian treaty of August 4th, 1877 prohibited the continued sale of white slaves after August 3rd, 1885, as well as prohibiting the import and export of Sudanese and Abyssinian slaves. During the Middle Ages, Slavs, S-L-A-V-S, were so widely used as slaves in both Europe and the Islamic world that the very word, quote-unquote, slave derived from the word for Slav, not only in English, but also in other European languages as well as in Arabic. Nor have Asians or Polynesians been exempt from either being enslaved or enslaving others. China in centuries past has been described as, end quote, one of the largest and most comprehensive markets for the exchange of human beings in the world. Good God, end quote. Man. Slavery was also common in India, where it has been estimated that there were more slaves than in the entire Western Hemisphere. Shut the front door. Oh my gosh. That is insane. And we're taught that it's the other way around. Oh my gosh. The United States of America. And where the original thugs kidnapped children for the purpose of enslavement. In some of the cities of Southeast Asia, slaves were a majority of the population. Slavery was also an established institution in the Western Hemisphere before Columbus's ships ever appeared on the horizon. The Ottoman Empire regularly enslaved a percentage of the young boys from the Balkans, converted them to Islam, and assigned them to various duties in the civil or military establishment. Race and slavery. The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. No, it grew out of a need. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself. Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. The Europeans who were enslaved in North Africa were despised and abused because they were Christians in a Muslim, M-O-S-L-E-M, region of the world, where they were called, quote-unquote, Christian dogs. Race became the most visible difference between slaves and slave owners in the Western Hemisphere. A distinguished historian, Daniel J. Boorstin, B-O-O-R-S-T-I-N, put it, in quotes, "Now, for the first time in Western history, the status of slave coincided with a difference of race," end quote. To make racism the driving force behind slavery is to make a historically recent factor the cause of an institution which originated thousands of years earlier. The enshrinement of racism as an overarching casual factor accords far more with current instrumental agendas than with history. The form in which the story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the lines of the best-selling book and widely watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley, H-A-L-E-Y. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, in quote, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by," end quote. This instrumental use of history, or purported history, is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making. First is the objection to falsification itself, that the damage which this does to the general level of understanding and trust in a society is incalculable and can easily outweigh in its long-run consequences, especially any immediate good that might be expected from an expedient taking of liberties with the truth. Second, even the short-run benefits are by no means clear. Has a sense of special grievance helped advance any people, or has what happened in centuries past been a distraction and an incitement to counterproductive strife, much as territorial irredentism has been, IRREDENTISM, rather than debate current ideological agendas? We can try to determine what we can about the actual history of slavery, including how it ended. No institution of comparable age and worldwide scope has ever disappeared over almost the entire planet, leaving so little awareness of how and why it vanished, or so little interest in that question. Volumes continue to be published about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, which for all its greatness did not encompass 1/10 as much of the world as the institution of slavery did. Archaeologists continue to excavate the ruins of ancient civilizations in Central America and the Middle East, while military historians pour through archives and examine ancient weapons to try to piece together the history of warfare. Yet remarkably little is written about one of the most momentous moral dramas in the history of the human species, the bitter worldwide struggle which lasted for more than a century to destroy the elaborate systems and institutions for the ownership and sale of human beings. While there is a sizable literature on the American Civil War for all its staggering carnage and historic legacy within the United States and an international perspective, it is only a small and highly atypical part of the story of the worldwide crusade against slavery. No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle as history is measured. How and why did slavery end in most of the world? There were two major processes. Over the centuries, as more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation states, and their own armies and navies raided those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came. Thus, more and more peoples became off limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of the sub-Saharan Africa. By the early modern era, sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe geographic handicaps, was one of the last remaining areas from which vast numbers of people could be enslaved. Far from being targeted by Europeans for racial reasons, as some have claimed, Africa was resorted to as a source of large supplies of slaves only after centuries of Europeans enslaving other Europeans had been brought to an end by the consolidation of the nations and empires on the European continent by internal shifts from slavery to serfdom in much of Europe, and by the Catholic Church's pressures against enslaving fellow Christians, which was by no means the same as the Church's saying that slavery as such was wrong. Similar consolidations of political units in parts of Asia led to a decline of slavery in those realms. While Africa became the main source of new slaves in later centuries, existing slaves continued to include peoples of many races living in many places around the world. And in the slavery of all these peoples was a very difficult process, and one requiring deliberate and sustained action for many generations. Ironically, the anti-slavery ideology behind this process began to develop in the 18th century Britain at a time when the British Empire led the world in slave trading, and when the economy of most of its overseas colonies in the Western Hemisphere depended on slaves. Here again, the baffling present-day disregard of an international saga of strife, full of individual dramas as well as historic consequences, seems explicable only in terms of today's ideological agendas. While slavery was common to all civilians as well as to peoples considered uncivilized, only one civilization developed a moral revulsion against it very late in its history: Western civilization. Today it seems so obvious that, as Abraham Lincoln said, end quote, "if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong," end quote. But the hard fact is that for thousands of years, slavery was simply not an issue, even among the great religious thinkers or moral philosophers of civilizations around the world. I may wonder why it took 18 centuries after the Sermon on the Mount for Christians to develop an anti-slavery movement. But a more profound question is, why not even the leading moralists in other civilizations rejected slavery at all? End quote. There is no evidence, end quote. Open quote, end quote, you get it. According to a scholarly study, end quotes, that slavery came under serious attack in any part of the world before the 18th century, end quote. That is when it first came under attack in Europe. Themselves the leading slave traders of the 18th century, Europeans nevertheless became, in the 19th century, the destroyers of slavery around the world, not just in European societies or European offshoot societies overseas, but in non-European societies as well, over the bitter opposition of Africans, Arabs, Asians, and others. Moreover, within Western civilization, the principal impetus for the abolition of slavery came first from very conservative religious activists, people who would today be called, end quote, the religious right. Clearly, this story is not, end quote, politically correct, end quote, in today's terms. Hence, it is ignored as if it never happened. Tanto ko hain kiki, you and Kuchanski, till we meet again. Love you, minute.